Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Better Call Saul, Season 3, Episode 1, Mabel. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Better Call Saul, so I have to give a spoiler warning for Better Call Saul up to Season 3, Episode 1. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. Now, I know what I'm about to say probably won't be that popular, but I personally found this episode to be the weakest season premiere the show has had yet. And that's not to say that I hated this episode, because I didn't at all. But Better Call Saul, for its first two seasons, tended to follow a format where it had a strong first couple episodes and then dipped a bit in the mid-season and then had a strong finish. This episode felt more like a mid-season episode to me, although I hope that means that this season will have a different format where it just gets better and better as the season goes, and that being the case, I wouldn't have a problem with this at all. I know the show has always been slow paced, and in fact this show does slow pace amazingly well, and in my prediction videos I did for season 3, I even said that I doubt that the pace would change in season 3 and would likely have the same slow pace as the two previous seasons, and I'm perfectly fine with that. In fact, I wouldn't have it any other way. That being said, I think the pacing of this episode was a bit too slow, and it was a bit too many drawn out scenes that didn't need to be as long as they were. But again, that's not to say that I didn't like this episode, because there were a lot of things about this episode to appreciate. First off, the show stays true to form by beginning the season with a flash forward, if you will, to Saul's time after Breaking Bad, while he's hiding out in Nebraska as a cinnamon bun manager named Gene. I liked this scene and thought it was fit perfectly into the collection, as these scenes have an air of depression and dreariness about them, so it makes sense that they're in black and white, as it portrays how bleak his life has become. But it's interesting that for the first time we hear Gene speak in these flash forwards, where a kid is caught shoplifting and Saul couldn't help himself but to yell out not to speak to anyone and to get a lawyer. And then we see him interacting as store manager, where he all of a sudden faints. Now this is really interesting, because for the moment he couldn't help himself but revert back to his old Saul Goodman ways, and by doing so was a big shock to him that caused him to faint. This may in fact have been the beginning of the reemergence of Saul Goodman in this timeline, which I still firmly believe the show will eventually explore in its final season, but we'll just have to wait until season 4 premiere before we get any follow-up. But I love the format of this show is using by showing us a little bit at the start of each season. So in the main storyline, it again follows the format of the previous season by beginning by showing us the final season's previous final scene of that episode, but from a different perspective and continuing past it. This was very interesting, as it shows Jimmy trying to help Chuck and relate to him as a brother, and it seems to work, at least for a brief moment, but Chuck had to make it very clear that he wasn't going to be distracted and that he will make him pay. But it was really interesting getting Jimmy's thoughts on it later on with Kim, where he explained that it felt good to relate to Chuck as a brother and not always be hated by him. So this gets back to how Jimmy mainly just wants Chuck's approval and wants to be loved and appreciated as a brother, but Chuck sees Jimmy's actions as an insult and personal attack against him, so the divide between them is likely only going to get much worse. And it's interesting to see how this interaction affected him, as when he was confronted by the military guy about being lied to in order to gain access to the plane, he at one point lost it and was like, "I'm sick of you always on your high horse." And it was obvious that he was thinking more about Chuck in that moment and taking his frustrations of him out on this guy. But he took a moment to gather himself and be more like his typical lawyer self in order to get the military dude to back down. But the whole scene was interesting, how he had his back to the wall, and although eventually managed to make him go away, he was really rattled by it and didn't handle it as well as Saul Goodman would have. So the scene with Chuck and Hamlin was really interesting as it answers and at the same time raises questions about the tape that Chuck recorded of Jimmy confessing. At the end of last season, several commenters pointed out on my videos that the tape couldn't legally be used to hold Jimmy accountable for his actions and to press charges against him. That seemed to be my understanding as well, but when the show released promos for season 3 that showed Jimmy being arrested, I thought that maybe the show was playing fast and loose with the legal realities, or perhaps New Mexico had some different state laws regarding this that I wasn't aware of. But it turns out that this was the case, and that Hamlin was just as puzzled as these viewers on what Chuck planned on doing with this tape, as he felt it served no purpose. But Chuck assured him that there was a purpose, and of course the scene cut before we could find out what this purpose was. However, in the following scene with Chuck, we see Ernesto accidentally hear some of the tape when he went to change the batteries on the player. But it seemed to me that Chuck was conning Ernesto, and that he purposely set up the situation by getting Ernesto to change the batteries. Of course, he acted like he intended to change the batteries himself, but of course that was all part of the con, and you can't let the mark know that it was your idea. And what a coincidence that the tape just so happened to be right at the exact mark where Jimmy says he changed the numbers, admitting exactly what he did. And of course, Chuck gives Ernesto this song and dance about not telling anyone how he'd get in real big trouble if he did. But I think that's more to sell the notion that it was all an accident, and perhaps drilling this "don't say anything" is a way to make it more likely that he will actually say something. So I believe Chuck does want Ernesto to tell Jimmy about the tape. For what purpose, I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps to get Jimmy to react in a way that would incriminate himself, but I'm not sure how exactly that would work. But if I'm right, this means Chuck is effectively acting like slipping Jimmy in order to get back at Jimmy, which has rich implications on how Chuck is throwing away his integrity, all on this grudge that he has against his brother that he just can't let go. And I can't wait to see how this plays out. So we also get a bit more progression in Kim's storyline as well. While Jimmy's away, she takes on some of his clients, which she insists she has to keep as her clients because they're not partners. Now, I don't think this is Kim trying to get back at Jimmy in any way. I think this is more to do with Kim's desire to be on the straight and narrow and strictly follow the rules, and not simply pawn off her clients to Jimmy, regardless of how much it's going to hurt her workload. We also get some interesting scene with her talking to Paige and Mercer Verde, where Kim seems to be excelling at handling their case alone, which they had worried that she may not be able to do, and clearly she was able to go the extra mile. But this led Paige to bad-mouthing HHM and Chuck in particular, and you could tell that this made Kim feel extremely guilty because she knows that it was Jimmy who screwed Chuck on her behalf, and this gets her subconsciously becoming more fearful of making mistakes and becoming a bit more pedantic about making sure everything is just right, which makes me wonder if this will somehow come into play later on. So getting to Mike's storyline, this was the one I thought dragged a bit, as it can be summed up just by saying that Mike thinks his car is bugged. He finds the bug and finds a way to get it back to those who planted it and to track them instead. And so it seems like a lot of screen time just to portray that simple information. And by bug, of course, I mean tracker, not a recording device. But yeah, I think these scenes did drag on for a little bit. But having said that, I did really enjoy the montage of Mike tearing his car apart to try to find the bug. It was quite well paced, as Vince Gilligan always does really great montages. It does go to show how savvy Mike is, that he immediately recognizes that his car was bugged after finding that note, and of course that he was able to find it and in fact use it to trace those who bugged him back to their source. Further goes to show how intelligent he is, and I think this initiative is going to impress Gus, and that will be part of the reason why he eventually ends up taking Mike on. And by Gus, of course, I mean Gus Fring, whom we all know was the one responsible for the note being left on his car and for tracing him, and it is who Mike will find. And I can't wait for this to happen. But all this was just set up for that. It wasn't bad. It was interesting to see how savvy Mike was, but the scenes did go on slightly longer than what I felt was necessary. So my rating for Mabel out of 10 is a 6 good. Not a bad episode by any means. It did further the character stories of the show nicely by relating how Jimmy wants to be loved by his brother, by showing the crusade Chuck is now on to ruin Jimmy, by showing how Kim has been affected by Jimmy's actions, and showing how cunning Mike is, and setting up for the introduction of Gus Fring. But overall, the pacing was a bit slower than what I would have cared for, and I didn't feel it packed the punch that the previous season premieres have, but still, I am really excited for the rest of season 3 and hoping that this will be the best season yet. So that's it for my review of Mabel. Be sure to check out my channel as I continue to review Better Call Saul every week. Also be sure to check out my channel as I do many more videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek The Expanse, The 100, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.